The last prayer of a dying monk faded into the smoke of burning chapels, a grim dawn breaking over shattered walls. For the warriors, torment had ended, but for the women who remained, those sworn to Christ, a nightmare far more profound than death was just beginning. History whispers of Viking raids, of swords and ships. It falls silent on what truly transpired once the fighting ceased, once the altars ran red. The sagas themselves dare not speak of it. For real documented Viking history, subscribe. Tell us from which city you are watching. This episode draws from Eben Fedlin's writings and the chilling archaeological discoveries at Dublin slave markets. Let us transport ourselves back to the year 845. The monastery at Clonmacnoise, a beacon of faith, fell to Thorgest and his fearsome fleet. 43 monks bravely defended their sacred altar, their lives extinguished in a desperate stand. The chronicler meticulously recorded their slaughter, then his ink ceased to flow. He never wrote what became of the nuns. But the earth holds no such silence. Archaeology speaks volumes. Excavations beneath Dublin's Wood Quay unearthed the horrifying infrastructure of Viking slave markets. Iron shackles, slender enough for a woman's wrist, were found. Ankle rings, no larger than a child's, lay beside them. Warehouse foundations, built not for grain or goods, but to confine living bodies, etched a stark truth into the soil. The Dublin Vikings didn't merely raid for gold or hallowed relics, they raided for flesh. A captured nun, once a servant of God, became mere inventory, stripped of her sacred identity, valued only as a commodity. Runic inscriptions discovered in Schleswig revealed actual price carvings, chillingly precise. 20 silver pieces for a young nun, 15 for an older sister, a mere 10 if she had been wounded during the brutal raid. Receipts etched in stone for human lives. Yet, even this dehumanizing commerce was not the worst outcome. The sagas will not tell you this. Being sold, becoming property, was sometimes the merciful fate. In the year 862, the monastery at Portmaro suffered a Viking assault. Irish annals dutifully recorded the deaths of 47 warriors. Then, once more, silence. No mention of the nuns taken from their cloisters. But soil samples from nearby bogs unveiled a different, far more gruesome truth. 23 female bodies were meticulously exhumed. Every one of them bore the same brutal signs. Blunt trauma to the skull, deep defensive wounds scarring their arms, ribs shattered from prolonged agonizing assault. These were not deaths in battle. These were ritualized killings, methodical, repeated. Carbon dating placed their deaths within days of the raid. They died after surrender, after captivity, once their fate had been coldly decided. And the Vikings, with horrifying consistency, always made the same decision.
In 871, the great heathen army captured Reading. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles recounted the defeat of King Ethelred. But what of the holy sisters within the abbey walls? The records remained mute. Again, the earth spoke where human words failed. At the ancient Saxon palace site, stains of iron oxide, blood iron, were discovered beneath the stones, enough to suggest the violent end of dozens of people. Viking war culture, savage as it was, operated under its own twisted laws. A defeated man's wife, or a nun under his protection, instantly became the property of her captor, not as a servant, but as his woman. The Old Norse termed it konor Anna, an owned woman, property explicitly intended to breed. The Gragas law codes from Iceland disturbingly detailed the process. The captor publicly declared ownership before witnesses. The woman's will meant nothing. Her consent was irrelevant. The act was legally sanctioned. Even the children born from such violence were, by their law, considered legitimate. But even this grotesque version of marriage was not the worst possible end. In 878, Norse raiders descended upon the monastery of Bangor. The annals chronicled its destruction, yet again, nothing of what followed. Archaeology once more filled the void of history. Burn layers revealed female bones arranged in ceremonial patterns. Viking funerary custom, it turned out, sometimes demanded human sacrifice. The killing of women as part of a warrior's final send-off. Ibn Fadlan, a Muslim explorer, himself witnessed such a ritual on the Volga River in 921. A slave girl, raped, drugged, and then strangled before her master's pyre. He saw it once. Archaeology confirms it happened countless times. Analysis of Scandinavian boat burials revealed the same chilling pattern. Female skeletons showing unmistakable marks of strangulation. Traces of henbane and other hallucinogenic plants found in their teeth. Drugs meant to dull fear, to force compliance. They died seeing visions. Perhaps in their final moments, they believed it was divine light. Or perhaps it was something far, far darker. This systematic dehumanization, this redefinition of human beings as property, was merely the beginning of an empire built on torment. The full scale of this horror would soon become terrifyingly clear. By the year 907, the Great Army wintered at Thetford. Chronicles catalogued stolen cattle and burned churches, yet remained silent on the fate of the nuns who were seized. But the midden heaps, refuse piles near the site, told a different, chilling story. Among the discarded waste, archaeologists unearthed infant bones, dozens of them. Each tiny skull bore unmistakable signs of deliberate trauma. These were not stillbirths. These were murders, systematic and calculated. Children born from the brutal assaults upon nuns, children whom neither faith nor father desired to claim.
Viking law was stark and unequivocal. If the mother was property, then her child was also property. If it could not serve, it was deemed unfit to live. Entire monastic settlements, places like Whitby, Iona, and Coldingham, vanished from historical records after Viking raids. Populations of holy women, once vibrant communities, disappeared overnight. Excavations at Repton, the great Viking army's camp from 873 to 874, uncovered 249 skeletons. Only 63 were female. The numbers offered a grim certainty. The rest were taken. Isotope studies revealed that the women buried there were not English. They hailed from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Christian nuns dragged from their sanctuaries, destined for sale across the unforgiving sea. The truly fortunate among them died in childbirth. The vast majority vanished into the expansive slave routes, northward to Scandinavia, eastward towards the mighty rivers of the Rus, southward into the bustling markets of Islam. Dublin, far from being just a port, functioned as a human processing center. Each new wharf extended the grim trade. Behind its whitewashed walls, the nuns of Christ were systematically stripped of everything, even their names. Their vows were eternal, yet their torment proved even longer. These were not temporary prisons. They were long-term storage sites, human warehouses designed for an unending supply. 9th century Arabic sources provided vivid accounts of Viking slave caravans stretching from the chill Baltic all the way to distant Baghdad. In these eastern markets, the nuns commanded the highest prices. Fair-skinned Celtic and Germanic nuns were coveted as exotic treasures, symbols of luxury and status among foreign buyers. The Vikings, ever pragmatic, recognized this demand and met it with brutal efficiency.
They did not merely raid monasteries, they meticulously supplied a global trade in sanctity and suffering. Their eastern route, a 1,000-mile descent along the Dnieper River, passed through Novgorod and Kiev. Ship manifests, painstakingly carved in runes, listed human cargo alongside valuable furs and amber. 20 nuns per vessel was a standard shipment, a chilling testament to the scale of their operations. But even servitude, forced conversion, or ritual sacrifice paled in comparison to the worst fate. This was reserved for the nuns who dared to resist. In the year 914, Irish forces successfully retook Dublin from the Norse. The annals of the Four Masters recorded this liberation, but not the profound horror discovered just beyond the city walls. Archaeological excavations unearthed execution pits, stone-lined holes built not for swift death but for prolonged dying. Inside, archaeologists found skeletons bearing deliberate trauma. Legs were broken to prevent any desperate attempt at escape. Arms were shattered to preclude self-harm.
The nuns were kept alive, trapped in agony, as their lives slowly, agonizingly ebbed away. Each pit measured 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, too narrow to lie down, too shallow to stand. The victims perished in a perpetual crouch over days, sometimes weeks, until thirst, starvation, or exposure claimed them. Viking law codes, disturbingly, described such punishments for slaves or captives who dared to strike their masters: burial alive, but never swiftly. The pit was dug shallow enough for air, deep enough to deny escape. Archaeological soil samples from Dublin confirmed long decomposition periods, stark proof that these nuns were left to die over an extended duration. The cruelty was chillingly calculated. Some pits were lined with jagged stones designed to amplify suffering. Others were filled with cold, standing water, ensuring a slower, more miserable demise. The purpose was not simply execution, it was spectacle. Suffering performed for those still alive. Other captured nuns were undoubtedly forced to watch. The message was brutally clear: obedience or unending torment. In 919, Norwegian King Harald Fairhair consolidated his power. Civil war ceased, and Viking expansion began to slow. Yet the slave networks did not dissipate, they remained. Peace did not end the trade, it perfected it. The very routes once used for violent raids evolved into organized systems of human trafficking. Records show Viking merchants offering guaranteed delivery of their human cargo. Even Byzantine trade agreements began to list such terms, demonstrating the formalization of this gruesome commerce. The Rus-Byzantine Treaty of 944 meticulously priced slaves by category. Young nuns commanded premium rates. Pregnant ones sold at a discount. Children under 10 were deemed nearly worthless. This was not chaos, it was cold, brutal commerce. By 937, at the Battle of Brunanburh, 5 Irish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms united their strength to crush the Norse. They won decisively. But what they discovered in the Viking baggage trains defied all belief. Portable breeding pens, iron frameworks specifically designed for living prisoners, chain assemblies small enough for children. These were mobile slave markets that moved with the army, modular compounds for long-term confinement. These pens could be dismantled and rebuilt in mere hours. Archaeologists found anchor rings, worn smooth by the constant friction of chains, undeniable evidence of their incessant use. The engineering was efficient, systematic, and utterly horrifying. The captured nuns were not regarded as mere casualties of war. They were the prize itself, living resources to be meticulously collected, processed, and distributed. Viking commerce depended fundamentally on their forced labor. Spiritual women transformed into the very machinery of an empire's economy.
The captor had to publicly announce his right before witnesses. A nun's resistance was meaningless, her consent irrelevant. If she chose to take her own life to escape, her captor could demand compensation from her family, 40 silver marks, the price of a life, and a year's labor. Suicide, in their twisted legal framework, was considered theft of property. In 978, Ethelred became King of England. His very first decree addressed Viking slave trading, not to abolish it, but to tax it. Royal customs records from London explicitly list duties on human cargo. 5 silver pieces per nun, 2 per child. The English were not disgusted by Viking cruelty, they were envious of its vast profits. Maritime archaeology confirms how alarmingly advanced this trade became. Shipwrecks along the North Sea revealed specialized ventilation shafts for living captives, water storage for weeks at sea, and reinforced hulls for stability under human weight. These were not mere raiding ships, they were purpose-built vessels designed for human transport. One such vessel, dated to 912, could hold 80 souls below deck. Burn marks suggest it caught fire at sea, all cargo lost. 80 nuns perished in chains, the ocean becoming their final watery grave. Yet some resisted in ways the chronicles deliberately refused to record. In scattered notes and skeletal evidence, faint traces remain: broken shackles, crushed bones near riverbanks, fragments of rosary beads buried in mud. Proof that some nuns fought back, even knowing resistance meant a slower, more agonizing death. Their defiance is the one thing the sagas could never truly erase. A nun named Gunhild appears in the Frankish chronicles, described as a freed North captive who transformed her faith into a searing vengeance. She had once worn chains, now she wore the cross like a weapon. Gunhild intimately knew the Vikings' methods, their roots, their deep-seated fears. For 7 relentless years, she led her own holy war against them. Frankish sources credit her with burning 12 Viking camps and freeing more than 300 nuns who had been taken from monasteries across the coast. She fought them using their very own tactics: surprise raids, night attacks, no mercy, no prisoners. Her final devastating assault targeted the great slave market at Rouen. Contemporary accounts speak of divine retribution. Every Viking trader in the city was executed with chilling precision. 47 men died the same gruesome way, first mutilated, then left to bleed out. After this act of biblical vengeance, Gunhild vanished from the record. But archaeological layers in burned Norse settlements along the Seine tell the rest of her story. Someone was hunting Vikings, someone who knew exactly where to strike and how to make them truly afraid. The practice of claiming defeated nuns spread far beyond Scandinavia. By the 11th century, Norman sources describe disturbingly similar customs in newly conquered England. William's knights received land grants that included all chattels found there. Those chattels included nuns, listed without distinction beside livestock and grain. The Domesday Book catalogued it without a hint of shame. Manor entries meticulously recorded female dependents as property, valued like agricultural tools. Archaeological studies of Norman castles reveal how this system was implemented. Beneath the courtyards, stone cells with iron doors and no windows were built specifically for holding nuns. Some could contain 30 at a time. Bone fragments from these sites show infant mortality rates nearing 100%. The children born within these brutal walls rarely survived. This was not neglect, it was calculated policy. A child of forced union was evidence, and evidence was dangerous. Mixed blood meant scandal, liability, and divine shame. Erasure became standard procedure. In 1066, Harold Godwinson fell at Hastings, and England itself became a conquered land. The Norman invasion mirrored Viking custom perfectly. systematic capture of Saxon nuns, forced marriages to Norman knights, and legal frameworks that redefined assault as holy union. Chroniclers of the time, blinded by victory, called it purification, the civilizing of the Saxon bloodline. But what history calls civilization was, in truth, ethnic cleansing through sexual violence. Dowries and inheritances transformed faith into currency. A nun's body could legitimize land transfers. Consent was irrelevant. Church records whisper of resistance. Some Saxon nuns chose martyrdom, taking their own lives rather than submitting to such degradation. The state, ever pragmatic, called it destruction of property. Genetic research now exposes what the medieval scribes desperately tried to bury. Isotope studies of graveyards show patterns of population mixing that trace directly along known Viking slave routes. Celtic and Saxon mitochondrial DNA appears in Scandinavian remains from the 9th century onward. It was not migration, it was reproduction through conquest. The Vikings created an empire of bloodlines. Modern Icelanders carry roughly 60% Celtic female DNA. Norwegian populations show 40% from the British Isles. Each number represents hundreds of monasteries stormed, thousands of nuns taken, tens of thousands of births forced by terror. Recent excavations in Jorvik, modern York, reveal something even darker. Beneath layers of medieval rubble, archaeologists uncovered a structure unknown to any text.
64 individual cells, meticulously cut into stone. Carbon dating places its construction around 876 CE. Every cell had chains embedded in the walls, iron rings polished smooth by constant restraint. This was not a prison, it was a breeding facility. Soil analysis shows continuous occupation for 40 years. Bone fragments tell a single, horrifying story. Every occupant was a nun. Every one endured multiple pregnancies, and all were discarded when they could no longer bear children. The building stood in the very heart of York. Everyone would have known. Church records from the nearby cathedral list the baptisms of children born inside that facility. 732 births over 4 decades. Only 12 children lived past the age of 5. The records call them foundlings of unknown parentage. They were sold to wealthy families as servants. Their existence used to fund new chapels and cloisters. God's work financed by systematic violation. Financial ledgers from York Minster confirm regular payments to those who operated the building. Not bribes, but official contracts for sanctuary services. The church was not a bystander, it was a partner. The pattern repeated across Viking-controlled Europe. Every major Norse settlement had its version of these facilities. Every bishop kept baptismal ledgers for the offspring. Every authority profited. The infrastructure was vast, the profits obscene, the suffering beyond measure. Yet even this industry of horror was not the end. The most devastating discovery comes again from Repton. Beneath the known mass grave of executed Norse nuns, archaeologists found deeper layers. Multiple burial phases spanning 50 years. This was not a single massacre. It was generations of elimination. Chemical tests show traces of mercury compounds in the bones, deliberate poisoning. The toxin acted slowly, causing madness before death. The victims would have raved and screamed, their minds disintegrating long before their bodies failed. It was a calculated cruelty designed to silence the nuns by making them insane. Under Viking law, testimony from a madwoman held no weight. Madness erased truth. So they were poisoned, not merely to die, but to be disbelieved. Even those who survived long enough to tell their stories could no longer speak coherently. Their suffering became its own erasure.
Excavations also uncovered the remains of children mixed with adult nuns, mother and child executed together. Families eliminated entirely to prevent their memories from carrying forward. Isotope analysis shows the victims weren't random, they were chosen. Nuns who had served as translators, overseers, or witnesses. Those who knew too much to live. Knowledge was the final crime. And then there was the inscription. A skull carved with 3 runic words. Beatrice far, better this way. Someone took the time, in the midst of mass execution, to justify the slaughter.
The skull belonged to a nun barely in her teens. She had been born in Norway, brought to England as a child, and murdered by the very people who had once called her sacred. The words carved into her bone weren't mercy, they were a confession. Even in murder, the Vikings needed to convince themselves they were right. They knew exactly what awaited captured nuns because they had done it themselves. If you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel. Here, we uncover the stories official history tried to silence, ensuring that their truth, however difficult, is finally brought to light.